The 2026 film adaptation of Wuthering Heights was awful. Let's talk about how we got here. Hello, and welcome to another video. So after a ton of online buzz, some good, but mostly bad, Emerald Fennell's adaptation of Wuthering Heights finally hit theaters. Prior to its release, despite the period inaccurate clothing, comically large fruits, and wildly wrong casting, people held out hope that this adaptation might still be good. I'm people. Oh, and there's a cat in here. Great. Okay, but you have to be quiet if you're going to be in here. I don't know how long this will work, but I'm going to let him be here for now. The logic was this. Perhaps there was some big reveal, some wild twist in the third act that our Kathy was actually just a modern-day woman fantasizing about what her life might be like in a delusional version of Emily Bronte's classic. Well, that was true, just not in the way we hoped. Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights is a self-insert fanfiction that disregards the reality of the story, along with most of its central themes, in favor of a visually stunning but emotionally void version in which Fennell has cast herself as Margot Robbie as Catherine, and cast the tallest, hottest actor that she could think of, Jacob Elordi, as her Heathcliff. The general reception to the film was mid, to borrow a term from the kids these days. It's sitting at a 61% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 2.9 average star rating on Letterboxd, at least at the time of filming. The Guardian called it a big movie with a very small mind, and NPR called the relationship between Kathy and Heathcliff ultimately more photogenic than it is deeply moving. Some of my favorite Letterboxd reviews include, "All of this could have been prevented if AO3 was made in Fennell's youth, and we already have a perfect Wuthering Heights adaptation, by the way. It came out in 1978, and it's 4 minutes long, and it was written by an 18-year-old Kate Bush." Prior to the film's release, I reread the book, which I hadn't done since high school. I also watched several documentaries on the Bronte sisters, just so I could be extra offended when they inevitably did my girl Emily dirty with this adaptation. And then I sat in the theater at 9:45 p.m. on a Thursday and took several pages of notes like a nerd. Now I have many thoughts swirling around my head and keeping me up at night, like Kathy's ghost banging on the windows of Wuthering Heights, which does not happen in the film, so here we are. In this video, we'll be discussing who Emily Bronte was, because this is a literary history video, how she came to write such an unconventional work like Wuthering Heights, and how the 2026 film adaptation failed to live up to the novel. Let's get into it. To truly understand Wuthering Heights, we first have to understand Bronte herself. Unfortunately, she and many circumstances of her life have made this very difficult. Emily Jane Bronte was born on July 30th, 1818 in Thornton, Yorkshire, England. She was the fifth child of Reverend Patrick Bronte and his wife, Maria Branwell Bronte. Unfortunately, the Brontes experienced a great deal of loss. Maria died of cancer in 1821, and this was followed by the deaths of the two eldest Bronte siblings, Elizabeth and Maria, yes, mother and daughter had the same name, in 1825. Following these losses, the remaining Bronte children, eldest son Branwell, along with Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, were primarily homeschooled. They enjoyed an unusual education, especially the girls. Their father encouraged them to read widely, diversely, and frequently, without censoring what they read. The children were greatly inspired by what they read and learned of the world outside of their village. They created these grand, ongoing stories centered in their own imaginary lands. We're often told this misinformed, inaccurate biography of Emily's life, that she was this sheltered, innocent woman who never left the confines of her father's parsonage. However, this is untrue. Emily briefly worked as a teacher, although by all accounts she hated it, and also studied with Charlotte in Brussels in 1842. In 1847, living once again in her childhood home, Emily published Wuthering Heights under the pseudonym of Ellis Bell. All three of the Bronte sisters published under pseudonyms originally. Emily became Ellis, Anne became Acton, and Charlotte became Kerr. Their first work was a collected book of poems, which unfortunately flopped and sold very few copies. This wasn't the case for Wuthering Heights. It gained a lot of attention, although its reception was incredibly varied. This was an extremely controversial, polarizing book. A review from Literary World in 1848 reads, It is a dark tale darkly told, a book that seizes upon us with an iron grasp and makes us read its story of passions and wrongs whether we will or no. Fascinated by strange magic, we read what we dislike. We become interested in characters which are most revolting to our feelings, and are made subject to the immense power of the book. A rough, shaggy, uncouth power that turns up the dark side of human nature and deals with unbridled passions and hideous inhumanities. Many critics and reviewers appreciated this remarkable work, marveling that it was unlike anything that they had ever read. However, they were still disgusted by its subject matter and characters. Sadly, Emily died on December 19, 1848. Apart from Charlotte, all of the Bronte siblings died of consumption. As John Green said, everything is tuberculosis. Branwell, the only Bronte son, would die of the disease in autumn of 1848, with Emily following in December. The following year, Anne would also succumb to the same illness. It wasn't until after Emily and Anne's deaths that their true identities were revealed. In Charlotte Bronte's biographical notice, she noted that they made a, quote, ambiguous choice dictated by a sort of conscientious scruple at assuming Christian names positively masculine. Regarding Emily, she wrote, in Emily's nature, the extremes of vigor and simplicity seem to meet. Under an unsophisticated culture, inartificial tastes, and an unpretending outside lay a secret power and fire that might have informed the brain and kindled the veins of a hero. But she had no worldly wisdom. Her powers were unadapted to the practical business of life. She would fail to defend her most manifest rights, to consult her most legitimate advantage. Charlotte continued to dictate the narrative of Anne and particularly Emily's lives, primarily in an effort to eschew public criticism. In the preface for the reissue of Wuthering Heights, Charlotte wrote, had Ellis Bell been a lady or gentleman accustomed to what is called the world, her view of a remote and unreclaimed region, as well as of the dwellers therein, would have differed greatly from that actually taken by the homebred country girl. Where delineation of human character is concerned, the case is different. I am bound to avow that she had scarcely more practical knowledge of the peasantry amongst whom she lived than a nun has of the country people who sometimes pass her convent gates. My sister's disposition was not naturally gregarious. Circumstances favored and fostered her tendency to seclusion. Except to go to church or take a walk on the hills, she rarely crossed the threshold of home. Though her feeling for the people round was benevolent, intercourse with them she never sought, nor, with very few exceptions, ever experienced. Charlotte wanted to protect her sisters and the Bronte name generally from further speculation and controversy. If people believed that Emily was this simple country girl, they'd be less inclined to blame her for the vulgar, blasphemous content within Wuthering Heights. However, we know that Emily was not the poorly educated, simple recluse that the Victorian public believed her to be. Although she appeared to be very private, and many of her personal thoughts and feelings are obscured within her poetry and prose, we still understand some fundamental aspects of Emily's life and nature. She experienced at least some of the world. She worked, she traveled out of the country, she witnessed the unrequited crush that Charlotte harbored towards their teacher in Brussels, as well as the ill-fated love affair between Branwell and a married woman, an affair that led to his alcoholism and drug use. And beyond her personal experiences, she read. In the pages of Byron's poems and Blackwood's magazine, the Bronte siblings learned of the world outside Yorkshire. And it was this understanding of the outside world, as well as the creation of her own imaginative lands, that led Emily to write Wuthering Heights. Good morning. It's a new day. Actually, it's several days later because after I filmed the last segment of that video, I became extremely ill and I have been essentially bedridden for the past 4 days. So let's just attempt to get through this, shall we? The story of Wuthering Heights is so singular and strange that it's hard to imagine how someone could conceive of it. However, I think that there is a fairly clear through line from Emily's childhood to her creation of the novel. As I mentioned previously, all of the Bronte siblings were imaginative and inventive. Together, they created rich, detailed stories in 3 invented locations: Glasstown, Angria, and Gondal. And just a note, there are real locations called Glasstown. Actually, I don't know about Glasstown, but definitely Gondal and Angria. But from my understanding, the Bronte's versions are just fictional places that use the same names. While Charlotte and Branwell primarily worked on stories in Angria, Emily and Anne focused on Gondal. Both of these paracosms had roots in the Glasstown Confederacy, an earlier fictional setting created by the Brontes as children. Glasstown was originally created when Branwell Bronte was gifted a set of 12 wooden soldiers from his father, Patrick. These wooden soldiers became central characters in the Brontes' imaginary world. From there, the siblings continued to invent stories for these characters, potentially, in the case of Anne and Emily, for the rest of their lives. From these original tales, we can find potential inspiration for the characters in Wuthering Heights. Quasha Kwamina Kashna was a native prince of Angria located in West Africa. He is adopted by the fictional Duke of Wellington and raised in colonist society. In the Angrian stories, there is tension between Quasha and Wellington's biological son, Zamorna. This may parallel the relationship between Heathcliff and Hindley Earnshaw in Wuthering Heights. It's highly likely that Emily took the characters and general plot lines from her childhood stories and adapted them to a Yorkshire setting. She also likely drew from her own experiences, as well as her understanding of the news and the world beyond the moors, to write her novel. For example, she notes in Wuthering Heights that Heathcliff, whose family and origins are never revealed, was taken from Liverpool. As the Bronte Parsonage Museum states, Mr. Earnshaw brings young Heathcliff to Wuthering Heights in 1771. The British slave trade had been operating for centuries by this time and wasn't abolished until 1807. In 1771, Liverpool was a major port for the transatlantic slave trade in Britain. By 1790, over a third of the city's trade came from Africa and the Caribbean, and it controlled 80% of Britain's trade in enslaved people. The fact that Heathcliff is found in Liverpool, described as an orphan with no owner or belonging to anybody, opens up the possibility that Heathcliff could have Black African descent, having been brought to Liverpool through the slave trade. Ellen's mention, "and you were kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England," has been used to support this interpretation. Ultimately, Wuthering Heights is a book in which the othered, in this case a disadvantaged person of color, rises up and takes revenge against his persecutors. As George Bataille writes, "The subject of the book is the revolt of the man accursed, whom fate has banished from his kingdom and who will stop at nothing to regain it. I have no intention of giving a detailed account of a series of fascinating episodes. I am simply going to recall that there is no law or force, no contention or restraining pity which can curb Heathcliff's fury for a single instant, not even death itself, for he is the remorseless and passionate cause of Catherine's disease and death, though he believes her to be his. For I intend to deal with the moral significance of the revolutionary nature of Emily Bronte's imagination and dreams. It is the revolt of evil against good. Formerly, it is irrational. What does the kingdom of childhood, which Heathcliff demonically refuses to give up, signify, if not the impossible and ultimate death?" It's also clear that the Brontes were thinking about early ideas of feminism, especially Anne with her novel The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Perhaps on some level, Emily related to Heathcliff, as a woman who could only attain a job as a governess or teacher despite openly hating the profession, as a woman who had to write under a male pseudonym to get published, as someone who was ultimately perceived as different or other. So how did Emily Bronte's story about revenge, her meditation on race, class, and power, the work that Victorian society viewed as a vulgar abomination, become the greatest love story of all time? The funny thing is, there is a lost film adaptation of Wuthering Heights from 1920, and it's advertised as Emily Bronte's tremendous story of hate. Fair. However, by 1939, that story was abandoned in favor of a romantic one in which Laurence Olivier plays a tragic, sympathetic Heathcliff in a tale of two star-crossed lovers. This aligned with many trends in film at the time. Wuthering Heights contains the same tropes and romantic ideals as other films like Gone with the Wind, which came out in the same year, and Casablanca, which came out in 1942. All of the taboo elements of Bronte's original work are erased, or at least smoothed of their rougher edges, and unfortunately, this became the case for the next 87 years. And that's not to say that every adaptation of Wuthering Heights is completely inaccurate and totally disregards the themes of the novel. I mean, there have been over 30 adaptations of Wuthering Heights, so I can't discount every one of them. At least the 2011 adaptation actually cast a person of color as Heathcliff, and there's also a Japanese version from 1988 that does look promising. However, it kind of seems like the creation of these adaptations over the years plays out like a game of telephone, with certain elements getting altered or removed completely. I think there are probably way more similarities between the 1939 and 2026 film adaptations of Wuthering Heights, and I know that Emerald Fennell put those quotation marks around the title so that she could curtail any potential criticisms of inaccuracy, but actually this is my video and my review, so I can do what I want. So with all that being said, let's talk about how Wuthering Heights 2026 failed so spectacularly as an adaptation. Okay, so I'm going to discuss the plot of this film at length, so obviously, spoilers ahead. You've been warned. It's 1771. How do we know that? We just have to trust and believe. We are staring at a black screen while we hear a man groaning, leading us to believe that we're going to open on a sex scene. But no, Emerald Fennell got us there. It's actually a man being publicly hanged. And this display leaves onlookers in ecstasy. People are running around, laughing, making out in the street. And I immediately thought, okay, if this is what Emerald Fennell is going for, she wants to make this sort of absurd, historical, psychosexual film, then why didn't she adapt something like Perfume by Patrick Suskind? But whatever, she didn't ask me, so we press on with this adaptation of Wuthering Heights. We then get our first glimpse of Wuthering Heights, and we're introduced to some of our main characters. Kathy, a young girl living with her alcoholic, abusive father, and her companion/servant, Nellie. Immediately, we diverge from the book. And I mean, we kind of already immediately diverged from the book with that opening scene, but we're diverging even more because Kathy is pretty and lovely and kind and nothing like the awful, evil little monster, put your paws up, that she is in the book. If you thought that we would be getting the horrific, awful, frustrating, book-accurate versions of Heathcliff and Kathy, you would be mistaken. Kathy also speaks in a posh British accent, which I know is nitpicky, yes, but I also know that they had the budget for a dialect coach for this film. So tell me why basically no one is speaking in a Yorkshire accent. Like, come on. Kathy's father introduces her to Heathcliff, who he rescued from the streets of Liverpool. Obviously, Heathcliff is white. Kathy's father also goes on to imply that he rescued him directly from Heathcliff's father, so there goes the whole mysterious origin thing. Kathy names Heathcliff after her deceased brother. So Hindley's dead. He doesn't exist. We've entirely removed his character, we've wiped out his potential future bloodline, and we've also removed a large reason for Heathcliff to take revenge. But it's fine. You know what? It's fine, and I know it's just all gonna work out in the end. I'm not even worried. Instead, Mr. Earnshaw is the one to abuse Heathcliff and force him to become a stable boy. At one point, Heathcliff actually takes a beating in place of Catherine, thus solidifying their bond. Years later, the Lintons move into Thrushcross Grange, the stately property near Wuthering Heights. Kathy and Heathcliff are now fully adults of indeterminate ages. Maybe they're supposed to be in their young 20s. It's hard to tell. And you know, I love Margot Robbie down. Typically, I think that she is an incredible actor. She is just so wildly miscast in this movie. I can't exactly tell how old Kathy and Heathcliff are supposed to be at this point because 1, there is an age disparity between the actors. 2, Kathy acts like a teenager despite appearing to be in her 30s. And 3, Kathy is supposed to be around 12 years old when the Lintons arrive. I literally wrote in my notes, why does it feel like I'm watching a community theater performance in which no one in the right age range auditioned for the lead roles? While spying on Edgar Linton and his ward, Isabella, I'm not sure why they made her his ward rather than his sister. Kathy sprains her ankle and is forced to stay with the Lintons for several weeks. And that's truly my favorite thing about the 18th and 19th centuries. If you were sick or injured on someone else's property, you basically just moved in with them. And as Kathy and Edgar spend more time together, he falls in love with her and proposes. This is a far cry from the original scene in the book in which Kathy verbally berates Linton and even goes as far as to hit him. Kathy returns home with a whole new wardrobe, and Heathcliff is standoffish, and they both pretend not to care about each other, whatever. But can I just say here that, first of all, I don't mind when there are anachronistic qualities in the clothing of a period piece. I like a little anachronism. For example, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette. I think that they're both great. I think it's totally okay to take liberties with the fashion in a film like this. However, a lot of the clothing and the fabrics just looked cheap to me. I also didn't like that Kathy had no defined sense of style. It was all completely incoherent to me. Like, Nellie obviously is wearing simple, understated, plain clothing because she is a servant. Edgar is usually seen in silvers and greens. Isabella typically wears crinolines and lace and ruffles in a 19th century style. But for Kathy, like, sometimes she looks like a milkmaid, and sometimes she looks like Little Red Riding Hood, and sometimes she's wearing latex, and it's all Slay Diva boots, but I don't know. It was visually assaulting to my eyes. There's also a BDSM scene involving Joseph, who is a servant, and Zilla, who is a maid. In the book, Joseph is a kooky old religious zealot, so this was really weird to watch. At this point, Kathy professes to Nellie, who I should add is the primary narrator in the novel, but obviously a much smaller part of the film, the guilt that she feels over accepting Linton's proposal. Nellie lets Heathcliff eavesdrop to the point where he hears Kathy say that it would degrade her to marry him, but he rides off into the sunset before he can hear the following bit about the two of them having the same soul. With Heathcliff gone, Kathy proceeds with the marriage to Linton and lives a lavish lifestyle at Thrushcross Grange. However, she isn't truly happy until Heathcliff returns years later, this time with a shorter haircut, a gold tooth, and a mysterious fortune. Isn't it funny how when a director wants to turn a gothic horror character into a completely innocent, sympathetic version of himself, they cast Jacob Elordi?
Green King. I love that. Goon King. Sorry.
At this point, Kathy is pregnant with Linton's child, Heathcliff has purchased Wuthering Heights from Mr. Earnshaw, and Mr. Earnshaw goes ahead and dies. It's here where Kathy and Heathcliff begin a torrid love affair. No, it doesn't matter that these two have never even kissed in the book, at least in this context. It's fine. We need these two hot people to make out. In a way, I think this basically cheapens everyone's relationship to one another. In the novel, Heathcliff continuously visits Thrushcross Grange to continue his friendship with Catherine, and Linton is well aware of this. Despite his absolute hatred for Heathcliff, a hatred that has extended from childhood, Linton still permits him to visit Kathy. I mean, that is until Heathcliff becomes an absolute menace and gets to be too much for everybody, but still. I also think having a physical, sexual relationship between Heathcliff and Kathy degrades their bond. At one point in the novel, Kathy exclaims that she is Heathcliff. Their relationship goes beyond the bounds of love, especially romantic or erotic love. They are as innately interconnected to each other as they are to the wild nature of the moors. In the film, the affair ends when Heathcliff offers to kill Linton. It's at this point that Kathy realizes that the relationship has gone too far and she banishes him. Out of retaliation, he then pursues Isabella and she agrees to marry Heathcliff. And this really, really bothered me. In the film, we have Heathcliff barging into Isabella's room, soaking wet from the rain, looking incredibly hot and sexy, telling her in no uncertain terms that he's only pursuing her to get revenge on Kathy. And throughout this entire interaction, he is continuously asking Isabella if she wants him to stop, which she doesn't. Heathcliff is a monster. He's a horrifying villain who perpetrates physical, mental, and sexual abuse against Isabella, and yet in the film we have negated all of this because he's asked for consent. We see in the following scenes that even as Isabella writes to Nellie, proclaiming that Heathcliff is evil, it's all a farce. He's dictating to her what to write, and she retains control of their sexual relationship. They have Heathcliff and Isabella participating in puppy play. Like, what more can I say? And I don't see this change as empowering for Isabella. I just see that Emerald Fennell didn't want to confront a challenging subject and didn't want to tarnish the name of her beloved Heathcliff. Like, I think her and Bella Swan were reading the same version of Wuthering Heights because, like, what's not clicking? What's not clicking? Following the news that Heathcliff and Isabella have married, Kathy falls into a deep depression. She tries to banish Nellie for allowing Heathcliff to eavesdrop on their conversation all those years ago. She stops eating and she remains bedridden. Kathy also reveals to Nellie that she's lost her baby, but Nellie thinks that she's lying and therefore keeps that information to herself. This leads to a lack of medical treatment for Kathy, who did in fact lose her baby and thus dies of sepsis. Upon hearing that Kathy is ill, Heathcliff rushes to Thrushcross Grange, but it's too late. Kathy is already dead. And that's the 2026 adaptation of Wuthering Heights. If you aren't aware, this film is actually an adaptation of just a small part of the original novel. While most directors tend to end the film after Kathy's death, the book actually continues for decades after, with the next generation either overcoming their familial trauma or dying in the process. In my Letterboxd review for this film, I wrote that this was Wuthering Heights if we completely eliminated some of the characters and completely changed the personalities, motivations, backstories, ages, and races of the rest. Obviously, having a white Heathcliff totally negates a massive part of his character, and I also found it frustrating that the only two people of color in the film, Linton and Nellie, were treated as the only two obstacles in the way of Kathy and Heathcliff's relationship. This is especially true for Nellie, who is completely and incorrectly villainized in this film. Emerald Fennell has said, quote, "The thing for me is you can't adapt a book as dense and complicated and difficult as this book. I can't say I'm making Wuthering Heights. It's not possible. What I can say is I'm making a version of it. And what I have to say is this. If you know you can't properly adapt it, then why try? Why subject everyone to your self-insert fanfiction?" The primary themes of Wuthering Heights are still relevant today. Love, yes, but as I've mentioned, race, class, and power. In the hands of a competent director, and perhaps as a miniseries rather than a single film, it could have been incredible. And that thought just bums me out. And I know what some of you may be thinking, that I only have so many criticisms because so much of the book was changed. When I watched the film, I was trying to think about what it would be like if I had no prior knowledge of the book. And I just don't think it's a great movie. If we take away all of the issues between the film and the novel, we're left with a cinematically beautiful but emotionally void film in which there is no yearning, simply two pretty actors on screen reciting their lines as if, once again, they were in a community theater production. Honestly, I think this review from Bobby Finger sums it up perfectly. Is it actually iconic of a movie this desperate for iconic moments to be lacking them entirely? Not really. Literally 136 minutes of failed attempts at iconography. Every time I looked up from my watch, someone would be in the ugliest room you've ever seen in your life with a look on their face that seemed to be saying, "Aren't I so iconic?" I'd be obsessed if I hadn't been so bored. I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit more about Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights, and all of the failed adaptations that have come in its wake. For this video, I'd like to highlight the National Black Justice Coalition. They're America's leading national civil rights organization dedicated to the empowerment of Black LGBTQIA people through coalition building, federal policy change, research, and education. And with all that being said, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!